Are we good?
Yeah, we're good. We are live. We are actually
Okay.
live on the channel. It just decided to take a
Woohoo.
minute. Hi, everybody.
Just like everything.
Just like everything.
Okay, well, hi everybody. First of all, I want to welcome you back to Seduction of the Innocent for our newest episode. However, I think everyone can tell that I have a touch of laryngitis tonight.
You poor
So,
thing.
this is what I like to call my sexy radio voice. So, this episode's going to be a bit more streamlined and whatnot. So, it might not be as long as last time, but I just we were really excited to do the show, and we didn't want to push it off. So I'm just gonna kind of push through this. So please bear with me, bear with my scratchy voice. As always, I am Mary. I am the senior editor for On Comics Ground, and I co-host Panel to Panel, and I like to consider myself an amateur comic historian.
My name
Kai.
is Kai. I'm the marketing director of On Comics Ground. I'm the co-host of Aggressive Negotiations, which is a Star Wars podcast. You can watch it here every Monday. I write books and I stream video games. And
Okay, I didn't know if I had to.
You
I
okay?
didn't know if I had to sneeze. I'm sorry.
Oh my goodness.
Okay. Well, on tonight's episode, we wanted to partially expand on something and partially talk about how it just kind of became a nightmare all its own. And tonight we want to talk about the Comics Code Authority, which was a method of censorship that the comics industry used from 1954 to roughly 2011. So we're going to start all the way at the beginning. We're going to go through the revisions, the two major revisions that were made, and how that impacted how stories were told. So, Kai, you ready to go?
I am absolutely ready to go. I'm super excited for this one. I didn't know it was still
Okay.
I didn't know first off, I didn't know that it was still all the way up to 2011. It was still a thing. So, I mean, that's one new thing that I've learned.
But you'll see how the revisions played into that.
I'm really excited. Let's go.
All right. Ever since the introduction of comics as we know them in the late 1930s, criticism of the medium was absolutely rampant. However, that criticism died down when America entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. As a result, many comics became star-spangled propaganda aimed at kids and teens. They preached the dangers of Italian fascism, Nazism, Japanese imperialism. I cannot talk tonight.
It's okay.
While promoting American exceptionalism and a wholly ironic and frankly unearned sense of American egalitarianism. But when the war ended and the need for propaganda was over, the criticism came back and gave rise to, essentially persecution that led to censorship that lasted for decades. Last week we talked about how Frederick Wertham's 1954 book Seduction of the Innocent really dragged all of that into the spotlight again. And, oh gracious, there goes my outline. And we want our conversation today to expand on that, so we're not really going to revisit the book and the congressional hearings much. Please feel free to listen to our last episode, where we talk about how the book affected everything, how the congressional hearings affected everything, and how it kind of gave rise to the Comics Code Authority. So we're not going to revisit that a lot, and we're just kind of going to jump into it from here. However, before we jump too deep into the Comics Code Authority, I want to point something out. comics were not completely unregulated until 1954. The Association of Comics Magazine Publishers was an industry trade group that was formed in 1947. It was meant to regulate the content of comic books in the face of the public criticism at the time. It had a quote, air quote, vague publisher code. And it really was. It was very vague. It was just kind of like, don't do bad stuff. But this would serve as a template for the Comics Code Authority. The ACMP was disbanded in 1954 following Seduction of the Innocent and the congressional hearings. But I just wanted to point out that little bit that, comics weren't entirely unregulated at the time. But after Wortham and after the congressional hearings, the Comics Code Authority was implemented in September of 1954 by the newly formed Comics Magazine Association of America. New York Magistrate Charles F. Murphy, who was a, quote, specialist in juvenile delinquency, was placed at the head of the organization and devised a self-policing code of ethics and standards for the industry. He established the CCA, basing its code on the largely unenforced code that was drafted by the ACMP that we just talked about a couple minutes ago. Before the Comics Code Authority was adopted, we were seeing instances of what's the word I'm thinking of? Backlash. Book burnings were pretty common at the time, and there were even instances of comic book burnings, because during the research I found a picture, and it was circa 1950, and it was just a group of people with boxes and boxes of comic books dumping them into an open fire.
You shared that on social media and privately earlier in a chat with me, and oh my god, my heart, it echoes a lot of those images that we see of, like, I want to say the Nazis, but also just like a lot of in World War II, but a lot of cult imagery to me, where you see like burnings of other propaganda or other books that they disagree with. It reminds me of, there was I want to say it was specifically L. Ron Hubbard's
I will take your word for it there.
Book. I can't even think of what it's called now. Battlefield Earth. I feel like there was staged book burnings, like that the churches had done. I say cults for other things, but with the church, I feel like that was a big thing. Either way, it hurt my soul. You made me cry
it's
at work.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely heartbreaking because, I don't even want to jump into those books were worth so much money now. It's like so much of the golden age has already been lost to history. And imagine how many of these publishers that have gone defunct, that these books were never were literally burned.
The loss of information just there is staggering, and that's what I'm mourning
so
more than anything
it is
else. Just oh my god, ugh. Anyway, sorry, I completely derailed the topic.
No, like, believe me, I welcome derailments today. It gives me a chance to let my voice rest. With the formation of the CCA itself, which the Comics Code Authority, I will pretty much just be referring to exclusively as the CCA from here on out, because Comics Code Authority is a mouthful. And yeah. Crap, what was I going to say? Oh, Lord have mercy, my mind just went blank. Damn this cold medicine.
Are we talking about what they're prohibiting at this point?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
let's just go.
I'm sorry. I just kind of completely lost my train of thought.
It's all good. I am right there with you. Let's just jump right into it then.
Yeah. I don't really, like, we really can't break down each individual point of the 1954 code because it has over 40 different tenets of things that are banned or very heavily censored.
Oh my god, that's a lot.
Because there are 5 different sections just for, nope, 6 different sections just for comics alone. And then there's an entirely separate section for advertising, which I think is really interesting. Is that the CCA went so far as to ban certain kinds of advertising from taking place in kids' comics, or comics in general. There was no liquor or tobacco in the advertising. Advertisements of sex or sex instruction books. And honestly, side note, like, I understand that it's the 50s and whatnot, but the wording is just so, gosh, like, it's really funny. You couldn't advertise guns, knives, fireworks, the sale of gambling equipment, anything with nudity in it. And, like, it's interesting because, you know, these really aren't things that were being advertised very heavily at the time. But what got me is the 9th tenet, is the 9th code in the code for advertising matter. The 9th one says, advertising of medical, health, and toiletry products of questionable nature are to be rejected, as advertisements for medical, health, or toiletry products endorsed by the American Medical Association or the American Dental Association shall be deemed acceptable if they conform with all other conditions of the advertising code. That they could advertise toothpaste, but it has to meet all of these other points first. It's just like, it was such a tight rein on censorship, even for just advertising.
I feel like, you know, that, wow, just you had to hand it to them. Like, it comes up a lot recently with advertisements, especially in video games, and look at how many advertisements are in comic books nowadays. Like, just looking, like, flipping through, it's like there were those half-page ads for Snickers. I don't know if those are still in there.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly because I've been reading indie comics and stuff lately. But, like, that's obnoxious. We think they're obnoxious now, but look at how hard they had censored that and been like, you can't do this, you can't do that, it has to be squeaky clean. I kind of can't disagree with that. Just on the principle that, yeah, you don't want to get kids smoking, or like, you look at all the stuff that's in things like video games and all the controversy surrounding stuff like loot boxes. Having that regulation, I can't fully disagree with the advertising aspect. I disagree with a lot of the other stuff, but like the advertising, I'm kind of okay with that.
No, I am too. Like, you don't want to advertise guns in comic books, but I wanted to illustrate that in a very gravelly tone of voice, mind you, that this is just how tight the reins were, that every inch of these pages were so heavily scrutinized and regulated. And I wanted to take special mention to talk about the advertising, because that remains pretty standard up through till 1989, which we will get to that revision later.
Wow.
But like I said, we can't really go through every single one of the over 40 points in the 1959 version. But I did pick out some of my favorite.
All right.
The CCA prohibited... Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, all right, let's get into your favorites. I love this.
Yep. These are some of my favorites. The presentation of, quote, policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions in oh god, words and language and eyesight are things I am not good at this evening. Basically, you couldn't represent policemen, judges, government officials, government agents as anything but these absolute paragons. Like, they were the highest of the high. They were morally unshakable. They had to be 100% good. You couldn't show them any other kind of way, because they wanted to show, essentially reinforce, I'm using air quotes here, to kids that you had to trust your government officials, you had to trust your police officers, you had to trust the judges. So I think that one is particularly interesting, especially when you look at so many real life corrupt officials nowadays, and even the corrupt officials that were, bopping around in the mid 1950s. Oh, there's a typo. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the outline and I just noticed a typo.
I was ignoring.
But, well, that's very polite of you. One of the other points is that, quote, in every instance, good shall triumph over evil. That in every single comic, the good guys always had to win. The bad guys could never win because that would, in a sense, be glamorizing crime or villainy. That they didn't want kids to look at these books and be like, oh my god, Lex Luthor just beat up Superman. I should learn how to become a supervillain as well. So they always...
I think I brought this one up, the last time we were talking about this when we were getting ready for this episode. I think I brought it up then. Because I write books, and I edit, and coming from like a storytelling standpoint, that would really hinder a lot of things. Like, you could never end on a cliffhanger. If it, like in a serialized story, you could never have the bad guys getting the upper hand. A lot of people argue that, like, in Star Wars, in Empire Strikes Back, technically they won at the end of that movie because the rebels failed, and it's kind of, that's upsetting. Like, that would have made so many stories difficult to tell on an extended run of things, if that makes sense.
And this is oh no, it absolutely does. And this is an opinion that I catch a lot of heat for, in that the Silver Age, in my opinion, is kind of boring as sin. And I'm not talking like every single Silver Age book, but the Silver Age for me, by and large, in a way, was really pretty boring, especially during the 60s. But I do want to point out that we did see a rise in space comics in the 50s, because that was a really easy way to skirt a lot of the issues, where, okay, so the code has banned us from talking about organized crime, so let's go punch evil aliens in the face, kind of a thing. So
this must be where a lot of, like, those weird tropes that don't make a lot of sense come from. Like, the restrictions placed on storytelling in the 50s and 60s. You just see a lot of, like, weird alien tropes, and you see a lot of, like, you think about it, and there's, like, all these stories that it's like Doctor Who, for example, and you're like, oh, this is 100% an allegory for organized crime on Earth or whatever.
Exactly.
It's kind of funny to see the parallels in what's happening or what was censored in comics to be, put onto the television in that way. Mm-hmm. So that's really interesting to actually to realize,
Mm-hmm.
And I've probably just completely derailed you again. I'm so sorry.
It gives my voice a chance to rest. And this is the one point that gets me, is the use of the word crime. The letters of the word crime, so CRIME, if they were to appear on a magazine cover, those letters could not be greater in dimension than the other words in the title. So, if you had a title and the letters CRIME were in any point in that title, those letters could not be bigger than the others to spell the word crime inadvertently. Like, it is written into the code that you cannot have these specific letters be any larger. And it's just like, that's the point that gets me, is that how ridiculous is that somebody sat there and wrote that out?
That would have made for some interesting graphic design choices.
Right.
Like, I'm sitting here trying to think of what's the word? Acronym? Anagram? Whatever. That you could spell like, so you couldn't have, like, children reading in my education system or something, because it spells crime, and you couldn't, like, have those, it couldn't be capitalized, you'd have to... That was a terrible I think example. This is also... I just threw words together.
Well, I think this is also plays into the practice that, if you have ever noticed, on covers and in dialogue, comics they're all in capital letters.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not necessarily something that started in the Silver Age, but I think that was definitely a workaround for a lot of people. But the big thing that the 1954 CCA did was it banned horror comics, which were a huge point of contention during Wortham's book and the congressional hearings, because crime and horror comics were very popular because, crime and horror are popular genres in pop culture. So, these are actually some of the books that Wortham took the biggest swing at. And same with the congressional hearings, is that, okay, you have these comics about organized crime. Now these kids are going to go start a racket because they were reading these crime comics. But General Standards Part B of the Comics Code Authority completely bans them entirely.
That explains why
it's so hard to the point that no comic What did you say?
I was saying, sorry, no, go ahead.
That no comic magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its title. All scenes of horror, excessive bloodshed, gory or gruesome crimes, depravity, lust, sadism, masochism shall not be permitted. All lurid and unsavory gruesome illustrations shall be eliminated. And inclusion of storylines dealing with evil shall be used, or shall be published only where the intent is to illustrate a moral issue, and in no case shall evil be presented alluringly. And here's a fun one. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires, vampirism, ghouls, cannibals, and werewolfism are prohibited.
So, like, literally everything
you
good.
Couldn't... Exactly. You couldn't have vampires or werewolves or anything.
That explains why they're so hard to find.
They banned werewolves. I can't. My brain has always had problems wrapping itself around that. I understand, you want to ban various, gory torture comics that EC, not DC, EC was very popular for at the time. They were a publisher that specialized almost exclusively in horror comics. Fun note, you can actually buy reprinted collections of classic EC comics today, and so that has been fun. I have a few on the shelf. And, to their credit a little bit, some of them are pretty damn gory. But I point out the horror distinction because that will become important to the story later. The same thing with the fact that the 1954 CCA also banned any mention of drug use. You couldn't name drugs, you couldn't show anyone doing drugs, you couldn't bust drug dealers, anything like that. Again, that will become important later. And what will become important much, much, much later is the CCA also banned depictions of sex perversion, sexual abnormalities, and, quote, illicit sex relations.
These were all in air quotes. We're sitting here doing, quote, sex pervert in the air quotes. So
exactly.
And we just gotta point out that we don't, endorse this stuff. We're just, showing you the history of, it banned this, and I'm sorry, it's just, I wanted to point out.
Yeah, we're using the language that is being used in these texts. I, as a gay woman, obviously do not think homosexuality is a sex perversion. But the CCA also banned seduction, rape, sadism, masochism, where specifically forbidden. Mary, you don't know how to type. Love stories were enjoined to emphasize the sanctity of marriage, and those portraying scenes of passions were advised to avoid stimulating lower or baser emotions.
So no porn.
Yeah. Well, romance comics were really on the rise in the 50s and 60s because it was seen, and it pains me to say this, but was seen as a way to bring in girl readers into comics. Even though, it's not like girls weren't already reading comics. Not the place, Mary, not the place. But, no, the romance comics, they were all pretty formulaic. They were absolutely melodramatic. It was usually a girl crying over a boy, and it was, she would eventually get him in the end. But, all of them were the same, and I think that's a lot of my problem that I had generally with the Silver Age, is that it's all completely the same. But I don't want to completely derail myself by going on a rant there. So we've covered that, they banned any kind of horror comics, any kind of mention of drugs, organized crime, any kind of, quote, sexual deviancy. It banned divorce as well. Anything that did not emphasize or promote the sanctity of marriage. No organized crime, no criminals. Kidnapping is weirdly mentioned individually.
Huh. So
it also banned things like anything fun.
Yeah, I was about to say anything that made it interesting or fun or.
Yeah.
That's unfortunate. Again,
it also mandates.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so what you're saying with the romance comics, again, a lot of romance comics nowadays, or not comics, just romance novels are seen as, for girls. I'm doing the air quotes, it's for girls, and are seen as legitimately in a lot of circles are seen as a lesser form of, right? If you write romance novels, you're not a real writer kind of deal. Not that I agree with that, but it's just that's the sentiment that goes around. It's the same with YA novels. You're not a real writer if you only do that, but romance novels especially, and they are still very formulaic in a lot of ways, where they have to have, there's always the drama and the interpersonal tension and the will they, won't they, but one of the things is that it always has to have a happy ending. It's not a romance novel if it doesn't have a happily ever after.
And to a degree, these romance comics, they were very much the same.
Yeah. And it's an unfortunate thing that seems to have... Hello?
Sorry, the headphones that I'm using kind of screeched out at me a bit.
Oh no. I hope I didn't hear anything, so
it was on my end.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, so it's kind of unfortunate. It's a little bit unfortunate that that's still something that is going around today. And it's incredibly interesting how
this
has influenced
we've kind of just dumped a whole, honestly, just a barrel full of exposition on all of the things that they have banned. Oh, you also couldn't swear or use slang words. Like I said, there are over, 40-ish things. And, hell, if we just went through it all point by point, that would be an episode in and amongst itself. Is, just all of the different subcategories and whatnot. But fortunately for you, you being the people who are listening, you can find the actual code for yourself at cbldf.org. They are the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. We will get into them a bit more later, but they have the code in its entirety on their website. So if you were curious to, kind of go through the whole thing for yourself, you can find it there. Now, we've given you this massive exposition dump about all the crap you couldn't do. How did it work? Members would submit their work to the Comics Code Authority, and the CCA would screen over each individual book. And if the book was approved, it would be authorized with the use of their seal, And we all, if you've ever read a comic book, you know what the seal looks like. It's that little white box that says, approved, kind of a thing. And at the height of its influence, the CCA was the de facto censor for the comic book industry. Now, this is kind of where it gets a little murky, because, obviously we all agree that to a degree, censorship is bad. But at the same time, this was almost a matter of self-censorship for the comic industry, as opposed to the fact that they came very, very, very close to being government censored, which, honestly, I argue would have been a lot worse. But I'm getting off on a tangent here. But no, the CCA would go through each book individually, and they would determine whether or not that book was good to go. And if it was not good to go, they'd send it back. You had to fix it. Huh. And this would go on absolutely unchanged until 1971, where we see our first real challenge brought to the CCA. And before we get into that, Kai, do we want to take a quick ad break?
Yeah, let's take a quick ad break.
I could use a drink of water.
Could you use a drink of water? Like a tall glass of water to go with your sexy radio voice.
To go with my sexy radio voice.
Go with your sexy radio voice.
Honestly, I think my own voice is throwing off my narrative here a bit.
That's unfortunate. Well,
right. I think that's fine.
You go take a drink of water. Give me a minute, and I'll do some ads here real quick. So first off, welcome to the ad break. We'll be quick about it, don't worry. On Comics Ground is proud to present our flagship title, Panel to Panel. Saturday nights, join hosts James, Mary, and Travis for a weekly discussion of all things comics. Reviews, news, thoughts, and surprises await you. It's the same content you love from oncomicsground.com, but spoken aloud. Tune in Saturdays at 8 p.m. Eastern for your comics fix. Also talking about the Excellent programming here on Twitch. Monday nights just got a whole lot more galactic. Aggressive Negotiations, a Star Wars podcast, brings you a weekly roundup of news, reviews, and general discussion of everything to do with that galaxy far, far away. You don't need to be Force sensitive to enjoy this podcast. Again, brought to you by On Comics Ground. Be sure to tune in on Twitch every Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. Then, for those of you who are more into supporting us directly, did you know that you can support your favorite writers and shows directly? Well, you can by pledging to the On Comics Ground Patreon. Your dollars go directly to running the website and paying contributors. In return, you'll get early access to op-eds and featured content before the website, ad-free podcasts, access to a fan Discord, and you'll be able to unlock merchandise for your favorite podcasts and series. Head over to patreon.com/oncomicsground and donate today. Mary, I think that's all the ads I can do before we start getting boring.
No, you're fine.
Do you want me to keep going? Because I can keep reading these.
Just do all of the ads. Start quoting your favorite commercials, damn it.
Oh, I wish I were... No, we're not going to do that one.
But in 1971... we see the first challenge brought against the Comics Code Authority. And that challenge was issued by Marvel.
20 years.
According to... What did you say?
It was 20 years before Marvel actually brought a challenge.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was from 54 to 71. So it was all of those years. Almost 20 years before the first... real challenge was brought against it. And according to the CMAA files, and you remember the CMAA are the people who ran the Comics Code Authority, Marvel had asked permission to publish a Spider-Man story arc about drug abuse, and they were denied. This request, however, triggered a review of the code. Because, it was a standard, Stanley and Marvel wanted to run a look how bad drugs are storyline. It wasn't glamorizing, it wasn't anything like that. It was, trying to show kids, that drugs are bad, and the Comics Code said no. But this triggered a review of the code, and revisions were crafted in December of 1970. And publishers had to, all of the publishers agreed to the new code, and it went into effect on February 1st, 1971. Now, this review it dealt with more than just drugs. The 1971 code relaxed the restriction on crime comics and lifted the ban on horror comics, which was huge. It also the liberalized standards on sex reflected changes in society, kind of a thing. After the Spider-Man controversy, the CMAA added a section on how to handle depictions of drug abuse. That this is a quote from the 1971 revision: narcotics or drug addiction shall not be presented except as a vicious habit. Narcotics or drug addiction or the illicit traffic in addiction producing narcotics or drugs shall not be shown or described if the presentation tends in a manner to encourage, stimulate, or justify the use of such drugs, stresses visually by text or dialogue their temporary attractive effects. You couldn't show, you couldn't have somebody lighting up a blunt and saying, oh my god, look how wonderful pot is, kind of a thing. Drugs always had to be seen as an absolute evil. There were no redeeming qualities for those, obviously for drug dealers or even people who were addicted, kind of a thing. And this relaxing of the restriction here gave rise to many really iconic storylines. The one in particular was when Green Arrow's sidekick Speedy was outed as a heroin user, and Green Arrow actually ends up kicking him out. Like it's a really intense storyline, but and Spider-Man got to do his drugs are bad thing.
His drugs are bad thing. Did that include alcohol use, or was it strictly drugs and tobacco?
I believe it was just drugs and tobacco.
Huh.
Hell, not even tobacco, honestly. I think it's things like marijuana, cocaine. Alcohol is never specifically mentioned. At least I never found alcohol specifically mentioned in my research.
Huh. It's weird what passes for, like, okay for kids to consume when there's so much actual censorship happening and so much, you know, you can't do this, you can't do that, but you can't have drugs, but alcohol and cigarettes are fine. It's weird.
Well, so keep in mind, in the 60s in the US, pretty much everybody smoked at the time. It was, you know, the negative effects of things like smoking were still in their relatively early stages. You know, that medical research was still in relatively early stages. I mean, hell, during the 40s, they had things called asthma cigarettes. They were cigarettes that were supposed to help with asthma. Or at least be a little less harmful on people with asthma. So I imagine things were probably much looser in terms of tobacco. And alcohol out after American Prohibition, it's just been a mainstay kind of a thing.
That's fair.
But no, I think you definitely do make an interesting point about how, you know, okay, we're going to very heavily regulate things like this, but, you know, tobacco and alcohol are seemingly fine.
It's just weird.
Moving out. What's up?
It's just weird.
What were you saying?
It's just weird just what was made available for kids and what was banned. It's just a weird dichotomy. Like, one thing is worse than the other, even though you don't want kids drinking alcohol or smoking. But, like, that was okay in their comics. But you can't have, you know, you can't bust a drug dealer because you can't have crime, and you can't have marijuana or whatever sort of. It's crazy. It's crazy.
But moving outside of the seemingly relaxed restrictions on the portrayal of drugs and narcotics, we move into the reinstitution of horror comics. And horror comics are big business. They absolutely are. They were then, and they are now. But and this is the part that I love so much, are there super specific outline for how these horror comics should be done. All scenes of horror, excessive bloodshed, gory or gruesome crimes, depravity, lust, and sadism are still, they were not permitted. So that went unchanged. All lurid or unsavory gruesome illustrations shall be limited. Inclusion of stories dealing with evil shall be published only where the intent is to illustrate a moral issue, and in no case shall evil be presented alluringly, nor so as to injure the sensibilities of the reader. You could do horror comics, but the bad guy still had to lose. And this next bit, word for word, and this is a word for word quote, is my absolute favorite of this entire revision. Scenes dealing with instruments associated with Walking Dead or torture shall not be used. Vampires, ghouls, and werewolves shall be permitted to be used when handled in classic tradition, such as Frankenstein, Dracula, and other high-caliber literary works by Edgar Allan Poe, Saki, Conan Doyle, and other respected authors whose works are read in schools around the world. You could do vampires, but it had to be, you know, a Bram Stoker-y vampire. Like, maybe it's just funny to me, but these, you know, the Frankenstein's monster and Dracula and all these other things, they had to be represented very closely to, you know, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Like, you couldn't deviate or add to or remove, you know, that kind of a thing. And like I said, maybe it's just funny to me, but I don't know. What do you think?
I'm a little bit kind of gobsmacked about the use of other high caliber literary works. Like, because weren't these books also considered trashy? Like, it just, no, it's hilarious by the it's infuriating. But like, I remember there being so much. My mom would tell me about, you know, in the 60s and 70s, because it was like, yeah, no, those were considered bad, and, you know, like, the religious people were like, yeah, no, vampires are bad, and you can't read this because it's blah 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 religion. So, and just the fact that it's like, you can make it as long as it's something that, you know, these well-respected authors that were read in schools around the world, like that. It's just, I'm gobsmacked. I don't really have anything to say about it, and it's frustrating because I'm just sitting here like, so nothing really changed in it. With the horror, it's like, okay, well, now you can do vampires, but it still has to be incredibly tame. You can't have The Walking Dead, literally, so no zombies, even though that was the thing in the 70s. That was the big up-and-coming thing in film. Nope, no zombies, and you can only have Dracula if it's Dracula. You can't have any, like, deviations from it. It's
Well, here's my tidbit. How the hell do we think Lovecraft worked into that?
Well, was he being, like, read in schools at that point?
See, I don't actually know. It was just something funny I was thinking about when I was putting the outline together.
I like that, you know,
just
Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, being high caliber literary. That cracks me up.
But no, like, that's just the part that I found the most entertaining.
I love it.
And outside of these editions, by large and away, the majority of the code was still upheld. It relaxed certain sexual situations to a degree. I mean, you know, the way sex was looked at in the 50s is very different from the way sex was looked at in the 70s. So you saw a bit loosening of restrictions there. It's not necessarily in the language, but more was allowed, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And something I failed to mention the first time is that in both codes, you could not ridicule or attack any religious or racial group. And, you know, on the surface, that is a good thing. However, you couldn't do this is why racism is bad stories kind of a thing. That, you know, you couldn't, you know, briefly portray these instances of prejudice to show kids that this isn't okay. And it led to some very horrifying workarounds. that again, I think I brought it up last episode, but I bring up this episode of Superman's girlfriend bring up the issue of Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane. Good golly, I cannot talk. Where she quite literally turns herself into a black woman. And like, God, it hasn't aged well.
We're gonna do a whole episode on that issue, aren't we?
You're damn right we are. Because it is just so mind-bogglingly confusing.
I love it.
And like, yes, I do want to do a full episode on just that one issue. And we have a friend who I'm really hoping to convince to come on and talk about it, because nobody loves Lois Lane more than her.
I'm excited.
So yes, dear listeners, please keep your ears and eyes, I guess, peeled for that one. But after all of these, revisions were put into place and all of this was said and done, a special meeting of the CMAA was called to basically chastise Marvel. Charles Goodman represented the company, and they promised after the publication of these Spider-Man issues, the company would not publish any comics without obtaining the seal of approval. Because those issues of Spider-Man, they were allowed to be published, but they didn't have the seal of approval on. So they pretty much said, okay, we'll let you do this once, but you have to promise to never put us through this damn situation again. And I just think it's funny because I have this image of somebody like hauling Stanley into the principal's office by his ear and sitting him down and giving him a finger wagging conversation for that.
Now that's in my head. Thank
you. Just a funny.
I love it.
Yep, you're welcome. That is one cameo that, damn, I wish we could have gotten.
Right? Oh, now I have a sad. No, it's actually funny. My filthy casual ass knew that there was that one Spider-Man, those 2 issues or whatever that didn't have the seal of approval, and a lot of people were like, "Oh, it's a misprint," and no, they literally didn't get the approval for it. I knew that. It was buried in my like Neanderthal, like the lizard brain, like way back. Like, Kai knows that. But
no, it's just absolutely wild that because that Stanley and Marvel wanted to do a drugs are bad story, it caused a small panic in the comics industry. But ultimately, that was a change for the better. And we see a second challenge brought against the CCA, and potentially a more damaging challenge brought against the CCA. And that was in 1989, when, the way I like to put it, is that DC took a baseball bat to the CCA. Because during the late 70s and 80s, only 4 publishers were still active under the CMAA. And here's another tidbit that I did, again, I neglected to mention the first time, is that after the institution of the Comics Code Authority, publishers almost immediately started going out of business. I remember seeing as many as 10 publishers almost immediately went out of business afterwards. So, by the time, the early 80s rolled around, there were only 4 publishers still active, and that was Archie, Harvey, DC, and Marvel.
Can I interject for 1 second?
Something else that played into this is that a major change in comic distribution made it possible for publishers to sell comics without the seal of approval. That change was the direct market distribution or comic book stores. This is the first time we really started to see comic book stores rise up through the market. And that proved to be a big problem for comics, ironically. How it used to work is that wholesalers would deliver comics to retailers along with other magazines to things like newsstands. The wholesalers almost served as an enforcement arm of the CCA by agreeing to handle only those comics with seal. That, only comics that had the seal of approval would be delivered to the newsstands. However, with direct market distribution, distributors who specialize in comic book orders can distribute directly to retail outlets. And I know that sounds like a bunch of legalese, because it is. But, newsstands, they were just fancy magazine racks, and comics were distributed like magazines. However, comic books saw kind of a rise to prominence, and, so people wanted to capitalize on the market and opened stores specifically for the sale of comic books. And that lets them kind of circumvent the process and just get the books from certain distributors. Distributors and retailers willing to handle comics without the seal of approval opened the door for publishers to bypass the CMAA and its censors. Freed from code restraints, new publishers experimented with material, including adult-oriented comics, in order to expand the audience. And because of this, in the early 80s, there was a rise in independent publishers that pushed and led to a push in 1982 for another revision. But this was kind of pushed around for a couple of years because a draft was written by a consultant hired by the CMAA, but it was rejected. And this kind of went on for a couple of years. Archie and Marvel favored retaining the 1971 code. They were perfectly fine with it. Harvey Comics wanted a new code, but warned against, quote, meaningless liberalization. And to be quite frank, I have no idea what that means.
Who is Harvey?
Harvey Comics was a publisher that, I want to say they were set up in the 40s, but they published certain things. They had their own minor superheroes, and they ended up going defunct in the 90s.
Oh.
So I have just shortened Harvey Comics to Harvey.
Yeah, no, I just don't know who Harvey Comics is whatsoever, because I'm a filthy casual.
It really started to peter off around this point. They were one of the few publishers that managed to survive the golden age and that wasn't bought by DC in their huge buying spree in the late 40s and early 50s. But at the time, DC was not having it. They argued that the 1971 code was, quote, an embarrassment and a hindrance to the creative talent of artists and writers. And they are not wrong. So, they threw a royal hissy fit about this. And as a result, the CMAA drafted a 2-part document that met with DC's demands for broader guidelines. Because what happened is DC pretty much said, change this or we're just going to keep throwing bitch fit, Try not to swear during this show, but no, they threatened to throw a bitch fit and, kind of started making noises about leaving.
Huh. Sidebar real quick. I looked up Harvey Comics. They did Casper the Friendly Ghost and Richie Rich and that stuff. Little Audrey or whatever. Way back when. So, sort of like a competition to Archie almost.
Yeah.
So I do know the characters. I just didn't realize that it was, that was their brand or whatever, their
that it was kind of its own thing there for a while.
I kind of just assumed that they were Archie characters. To be totally frank.
I have not tracked the progression of what happened to Harvey characters afterwards.
That's okay. I just wanted to. I just jumped on the Googles to be like, who's Harvey Comics? Do I know any of that stuff, or are those like those weird Western comics that I never read as a kid? Because I never read comics as a kid. But no, it was Casper the Friendly Ghost and Richie Rich and all that sort of stuff. And I feel like they were like active still. No, there's got to be somebody else holding the license. I will look that up later. It's not important. I'm sorry I derailed you. I just felt like I needed to know that, and maybe your voice could have used a break for 90 seconds or so while I go, hey, I know this.
I need to take another drink of water, so why don't you just tell me how the chat's doing since we record this live as a way to vamp while I take a drink of water.
Right. So there's nobody in the chat. It's mostly just me on the Uncomics ground as the admin talking to myself. I'm very sorry. Yeah. I have nothing to report, sir. I could.
Okay. Well, still, it just gave me an opportunity to get a drink of water.
It's all good. So DC wasn't having it, and they threatened to leave. Is where we were at. They threatened to leave.
Well, they made noises.
Yeah.
They were making subtle noises about it. The quote, principles of the Comic Code Authority contained general statements about violence, language, and other areas of concern. The second part, the editorial guidelines, listed specific rules for each of the content areas.
So this is
the CMAA forbid the release of the internal document to the public.
So this is the new one, the one that came again after. In the 80s.
It was a 2-page document.
Okay.
That the CMAA is just kind of like, well, crap. What do we do? Because, at the time, DC was probably the larger of the publishers. So you've got the cash cow sitting there, going around stomping their feet and being angry. So they had no choice but to react. So the code went from do not do these specific things to, maybe don't do this stuff, I guess, if you don't want to. But the biggest changes in the 1989 revision, it removed the bans on mentions of homosexuality. Because after, and I mentioned this briefly in the last episode, at this point in time, homosexuality had been removed from the list of mental disorders by the American Psychiatric Association. So it was no longer classified as a mental illness. And up until this point, DC had been poking this butt with the introduction of characters like Maggie Sawyer in the Superman franchise. And you knew she was gay. There was every finger in the world pointed at the fact that she was gay, but they couldn't say it. And after the 89 revision, removed that because, yes, in the subsection characterizations, it literally says, character portrayals will be carefully crafted and show sensitivity to national, ethnic, religious, sexual, political, and socioeconomic orientations. So sexual orientations were explicitly put into this of, something that you would show sensitivity to. And, this is absolutely, the word I think Kai likes to use is gobsmacking, because if you look at history where it is, this was during the height of the AIDS crisis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And maybe I'm giving a little too much attention to this, but kind of like as a gay woman, this was a turning point for me and many others. because in the 1990s, DC dumped all of the gay into their comics. So, like, that's kind of an emotional moment in comic history for me, that, you know, my favorite publisher took a baseball bat to this thing and just said no, and kept, you know, beating it until it finally gave up. But again, I'm going off on a tangent here. But not only did these did the revision remove bans on homosexuality, it also loosened the rest of the restrictions that gave way to much heavier storylines in the 1990s. You know, we saw things like the X-Men relaunch and the death of Superman, which was huge. However, unfortunately, the impact of these changes really weren't widely felt throughout the industry because of the industry bubble burst in the 1990s. Sales absolutely plummeted during the 90s. So that's kind of the frightful irony of this whole thing, if you will, that, you know, these final things were removed just in time for speculators to crash the comic market. And it was honestly through the grace of God and the death of Superman that the industry was able to survive. But after this, the Comics Code Authority was pretty much dead at this point. Marvel kicked it in the shin in 2001 when they chose to leave the Comics Code Authority in favor of their own in-house rating system. And if you pick up a comic book today, you'll notice that, you know, they have a little rating. It's usually around by the barcode, and it's, you know, T, T+, M. It's very similar to what we understand today as the ESRB rating for video games. It is essentially the same thing. And in 2011, DC left the Comics Code also in favor of their own in-house system, and Archie very quickly followed in 2011 as well. As I mentioned before, Harvey Comics had went defunct in 1994, so they are completely removed from the board here. So by 2011, the 3 remaining publishers had left the CCA, and in 2011, it was officially dead. Today, publishers regulate their own content in their own comics. They use their own rating systems, and again, you usually see them by a little barcode there. And the infamous seal of approval, that little white box, was acquired by the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. They are a nonprofit organization that protects the First Amendment rights of comic creators, publishers, and retailers by covering legal expenses. So they took the notorious symbol of comic censorship and raised it up as a banner because they fight all forms of censorship in comics. And it's that little method there that kind of inspired me to want to do the same with the whole Seduction of the Innocent title, where you raise it up kind of a thing. And I absolutely love the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, commonly referred to as the CBLDF. You can go to their website at cbldf.org. They have the 1954, the 1971, the 1989. They have all of these comics. All of these codes and revisions. They have fabulous history that you can look at. They auction off various signed books. I actually have the website open on my browser right now. And as of taping right now, they have a copy of the Walking Dead Volume 2 hardcover signed by Charlie Adlard. And it's going for $50 right now, and the proceeds for that sale go into the CBLDF Legal Defense Fund. They also publish a circular called the CBLDF Defender, where your comic shops can order them. It looks like a little single issue. Your comic shops can order them, and it's basically a newsletter. So if you visit a local comic shop, ask them if they have the CBLDF Defender and pick it up for yourself. You can also join the CBLDF. It's basically the American Civil Liberties Union of comic books. I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but literally words cannot describe how much I love the CBLDF. And I suppose it makes sense for me to go on a tangent here towards the end. But with the official death of the CCA in 2011, that's where, honestly, our story concludes. That the bastion of censorship in comics from 1954 to 2011. What do you think, Kai?
So the one question I had was, is that why we see now, like, the CCA being, officially dead? Was that why we saw the rise of more independent comics? But then I was looking at like smaller publishers like Dark Horse and stuff, but Dark Horse has been around since 1986.
Here's the thing, is that in the late 80s and early 90s, when we saw a lot of these publishers coming up, these indie publishers like Image and Dark Horse and even Vertigo, which is a DC-owned mature imprint, these books were not put to the comics code. And it was because of local comic shops, or comic book stores, if you will, that these gave these books an avenue to be sold. So you saw things like Image, you had things like Milestone, and all of these little publishers coming up that didn't have to submit themselves to this censorship. But the shock of that book and the hearings lasted in the big two for decades. So it's kind of where you see the interesting fork in the road.
I was going to joke when you were talking about the stuff in the 90s. I was going to make a joke about when it's like...
sorry?
I was going to make a joke when you were saying after the 1989 revision... I was going to make a really kind of dark joke, being like, that explains all those terrible X-Men comics in the 90s, why everything got so brutally dark. Like, you just finally removed all the censorship and all of the, like, no, you can't show death, you can't show gore, and then we ended up with all of those...
Edgelord comics.
I was gonna say I was gonna be nice about it and say, like, those influential stories that are still, being touted as these. It's a pinnacle, a crowning achievement, but it was really just edgy edgelord BS. I'm trying not to swear, and it's really hard, and I'm trying to be nice, which is also really hard.
Right.
But I mean, that explains a lot about why I wasn't allowed to read comics in the 90s as a 6-year-old,
Mm-hmm. Well, the way I like to think of it is that, the absolute dump of ultra dark, ultra violet comics in the 90s after the 89 revision is kind of like when a party kid turns 21. Here in the US, is that you tend to go a little overboard at first. And so all of a sudden you can be as dark and violent as you wanted, so you were just gonna dump that in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
and comics went... What'd you say?
I was gonna say, the legal drinking age in Canada is 18.
Yeah.
So, I was gonna make another joke, but it's fine. We all good.
Yeah. But, And honestly, throughout the rest of the 90s, and even in to the early part of the new millennia, comics were pretty edgelordy.
They were dark. They were dark for the sake of being dark, because suddenly all the restrictions were gone. And that's crazy. That's crazy.
And the ironic thing is that, we also saw a lot of ridiculous portrayals of women physically in 90s comics, it was all boobs, hips, and no internal organ.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually had a part because of the collapse of the comic code in the air quotes collapse of the code in the 89 revision, because from 1954 onward, there is a specific tenet in the code that says that women cannot be portrayed in an exaggerated fashion, that they can't have, and that basically said that women can't have boobs out 4 feet out from their chest, kind of a thing, that women had to be presented as quote unquote normal. And then once that's gotten rid of, what do you see in the 90s is a lot of big boobs, no internal organs, and a giant butt. So I do think that is ironic that you can sit here with a marker, a figurative marker, of course, and just trace all of these lines throughout comic history.
Wow. I learned a lot tonight.
So it's just it's entertaining and depressing all at the same time.
And educational if you listen to us ramble for an hour and a half.
Yeah. Although I'm pretty sure some people are going to click into this episode, hear my voice, and go, you know what, I'll come back next week.
You don't sound that bad. I'm sorry that you're so sick. That's unfortunate.
Oh, it happens. My wife works with kids and she brought it home with her.
That's why you always tell her to leave work at work. Don't bring work home with you.
Yeah, but
It is what it is. Well, thank you so much, Mary, for educating me on the Comics Code Authority and how it sincerely affected comics as we know it today.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting history to look at, and I was a little scatterbrained this episode, but I think that it laid out some pretty good information.
Really did. I learned a lot.
That, and, you can tell throughout the different ages of comics the way that the narratives have shifted.
Mm-hmm.
And again, why I do firmly believe that the Silver Age was boring. With very few exceptions, but by large and away, I do think the Silver Age was kind of boring.
That's a totally fair assessment.
Yeah.
No,
anyway, do you have anything you want to say to close out the show?
I was about to ask you the same thing.
I really don't have much to add. I'm not 100% certain right now what the next episode will be. I've got a couple different things I'm looking at. But, other than that, thank you for taking this multi-decade journey with us through the annals of comic censorship.
Well, thank you for being our tour guide, Mary. This has been an educational blast.
You're very gravelly voiced tour guide.
I mean, if you had a British accent, it would have just been like little bit too tropey, but this has been fun. Thank you everybody for joining us and listening to this whole big long ramble.
Mm-hmm.
Please do support
I hope that you guys had fun listening to the episode and that you will come back next week, hopefully when my voice has returned.
Yes, and please do support the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund if you have the opportunity. I think they are doing some fantastic work. Thank you again for tuning in. We'll be back next week, and there's plenty of more programming throughout the week. Tomorrow is Panel to Panel. If you come back, if you're watching on Twitch, if you're listening to this on a podcast, please ignore everything I just said except for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. Definitely do support them.
Absolutely.
All right, Mary, have a great night, and thank you guys for tuning in.
Yep.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.